Hello everybody, I hope you're all doing well today. So I thought I would come on here and talk about a topic that's going to probably be a little bit controversial for some people. And off the bat, I just want to say that I don't intend for this to come across as some kind of misogynistic or sexist kind of slagging off kind of thing towards women. That's not my intention at all. My intention with this video is to talk about a few things that I've, my own observations, my own experiences with regards to dating, or rather being in relationships, and just some of the kind of, just more than anything, just a few observations really. And I'm not saying that anything that I say in this video applies to all women, of course not. There's lots of variations of women in terms of personalities, how they approach relationships with men, and obviously the same thing applies with men as well. So I'm not trying to make some massively sweeping statements or sweeping generalizations about every single woman in this video, of course not. But I'm just gonna point out a few things that I personally think are kind of a bit kind of odd or hypocritical, or a bit kind of mad sometimes, and the sense that there's sometimes double standards. I'm somebody that's been in relationships now for the better part of just about, give or take, the last 15 years of my adult life. Before I became an adult, as I've mentioned in previous videos, obviously I had crushes during my childhood, during my teens. I had quote-unquote girlfriends as a young lad, as a teenager. And of course, probably like any heterosexual male or female, I had obviously interests in women that never came to anything. Things that potentially could have gone somewhere but never resulted in any romantic outcomes. But that's life. But anyway, eventually, having gone through a lot of kind of, really quite a lot of, sort of relatively kind of, mild frustrations with women to some extent, not feeling like I was noticed, not feeling like I was attractive, which didn't help, and I didn't realise that until much later on, that women tend to feed off your insecurities, and quite often they tend to manipulate them in some sense. Again, I didn't know this stuff as a teenager. I didn't know this stuff as a young man, really. And so a lot of things that I've learned have obviously been born out of experience and difficult times, difficult periods. Like most men, there's been times I wanted to be in a relationship with someone, but they didn't feel the same way about me. There were times when certain connections kind of just fizzled out. There was times when it was obvious that nothing was ever gonna happen. I've had a whole range of different experiences with women, but anyway, that's kind of neither here or there really in many ways. But from 2010, that's when I really had my first real adult relationship. And while in many ways I enjoyed it at the time and I learnt a lot from it, I think in many ways I was probably a little bit too immature for my own good. And but then again, I was only in my own 20s then, so I probably shouldn't be too hard on myself. But I sometimes do think I should have been a little bit wiser, really, because I think I was perhaps in some ways a bit more naive than I should have been at the time. But again, you live and learn, and it's easy to look back 15 years on to your 21-year-old self and critique it and place onto that younger version of yourself things that you are now and things that you've the wisdom that you have now. And so I think you just have to be careful, not to kind of be too overly harsh with yourself. And we all make mistakes. We've all got involved with people that we probably shouldn't have been, and that's a two-way thing. It's like my ex. I should never have got involved with her, and she should never have got involved with me. But hey ho, that's life. And it was fun at the time, and it was we had some good times together. And for a young man of 21, it was, in some ways it was, I genuinely loved that woman. I really did, and I think in her own way she loved me. But but it just wasn't. It just didn't work out. It just wasn't right because we were just too much of an age difference. We were just two very different individuals, and I think in the end we just kind of got a bit tired of each other, and I personally just got tired of the accusations all the time, and just what seemed to me to be a little bit of paranoia at times, but that's just my interpretation. I don't know whether that was the case, but it just kind of seemed like sometimes it was a bit excessive, and just I don't know. It just sometimes I just felt like I never really knew where I stood with her, really, and I just kind of found that that's the same thing with my current relationship or my marriage. It's you just never truly know where you stand sometimes with your partners, or maybe even with women in general, because I think a lot of women, not all, but a lot of women tend to be a lot more, how do I put it, like just a little bit emotionally unstable perhaps at times, and I don't mean that as I'm not trying to be insulting here, but like I just think that sometimes it's difficult to know where you stand. But then again, you could also apply that to men as well. Men have their ups and downs, and we can just be just as moody and unpredictable at times, as I suppose. But I can only say what I've personally experienced myself. As an observer, as someone that's been in a romantic relationship, and that's that. Sometimes I think women can be unpredictable. There can be. And that doesn't mean that I want women to always be exactly the same 24 hours a day. I'm just saying that what I mean by that is you just never know what's going through their heads. You never know what they're thinking or feeling towards you. And that's sometimes that's problematic because it leads to issues later on down the line, because you don't really know what's going on with them. You don't know if they have any issues with you, if there's any kind of resentment going on or bitterness for some reason or other. And again, like I said before, I've touched on before in the video, like that kind of stuff. It just doesn't really lead anywhere positive. I think sometimes it's better to just kind of have it all out in the open, really. Just get it all out of your system and just lay it all on the table for the other person to see. Just let them know what's good. I think it's better for people to just know what's going on, you know, rather than hiding it away or, you know, being worried about how somebody might view that stuff. You know, I think, you know, you can't control what other people, you know, you can't control what other people think and feel about you. That's just part of life, really. And so you shouldn't worry about it, I think. You know, especially when you're supposed to be with someone that you deeply care about, you know, you deeply love. But sometimes I just think, in my experiences, sometimes I just felt like a lot of the time it just feels very conditional with women. It feels like you always have to have something on the table for them. You know, you always have to have something. You know, it's like an agreement almost. You know, it's a conditionality type thing. You know, it's always. I don't know, and sometimes it just feels very one-sided, like it's always, why is it always men that have to do everything? Why is it always men that have to sacrifice everything for their women? It's like, well, shouldn't it be a bit of both? You know, why is it always men that have to take all the, you know, the ups and downs of women, but yet women don't want to tolerate the ups and downs of men? Well, I'm sorry, but that, you know, that's part of the deal, isn't it? You know, that's what relationships are, you know, and this is the problem when we go into relationships with so many delusions, really, so much naivety, so many unrealistic expectations of each other, and then over time we become disillusioned, we become disappointed with each other, and you know, that just then leads to internal frustrations and you know, bitterness and resentment, and before you know it, you know, you end up with a couple that's, you know, been together for a few years or for a few decades that basically more or less hate each other's guts. And I don't know, I just sometimes think that, and the thing is, I think eventually people get attached to that kind of negative dysfunctionality, you know, that negative way of treating each other. You know, they get attracted to it almost. You know, it becomes the new form of lust or something. You know, it's like I just find that a lot of things can become very toxic over time if you're not careful. Because, you know, the natural, you know, every relationship's going to go through a period of natural decay anyway. You know, it doesn't matter how much money you have to offer. It doesn't matter how many things you can give your partner. But I just think that I find women in general, and I don't mean to be rude, but like I just find them to be quite ungrateful. Actually, they don't appreciate your efforts a lot of the time. They don't seem to show much gratitude for the things that you do for them. It's like, you know, it's almost just that they expect all the time. You know, that it's just they expect. And then, you know, it just becomes a pattern of, so what, you know, so what, you took the rubbish out, you did this, and that, you know, it's like that. And I'm not saying that you have to, you know, I'm not saying that you have to say thank you and, you know, go over the top with every little chore or something that we do for you. But it's like, you know, from time to time it would be nice for you to just say, you know, I appreciate what you do for me, and I appreciate what you do for that, you know, whatever it is, whether it's, you know, if you've got kids or if you've got some kind of a business going, you know, whether it's, you know, saving money, whatever it might be, you know, just working yourself to death basically, just to kind of make sure that everything, you know, the stability and security. But the thing, you see, I think over time, like, I think a lot of relationships go through this period of you know, what now kind of thing. You know, where are we now? What are we doing now? You know, once the physical attractiveness disappears, which it inevitably will for most people. Maybe not in its entirety, not until you probably reach your 60s, 70s probably, if you're both kind of relatively in shape and healthy. You know, you're going to go through a stage where you're not going to find each other particularly attractive physically, but so therefore at that point you have to reconnect on a different level. It can no longer just be about lustfulness or kind of very superficial kind of things. It has to become about something more than that. Something you have to find reasons to stay together after that point. You have to, and that's why I think that often men tend to, at a certain point, go out with start spending more time with their friends, and also that probably applies in many ways to women as well. Because they find more interest in the company of other people rather than they do with the people. And obviously part of that is because, if you've known each other for years or decades even, it's like there's only so much you can talk about, And obviously if you're not seeing your friends all the time, you're certainly not living with them, then you're going to have more to talk about. And that's the kind of weird, strange kind of reality of romantic relationship. We expect them to kind of stay the same forever, and they don't. They change over time, and somehow you have to find a way to either adapt to find some other kind of new forms of compatibility in some ways, or you have to move on. You have to make a choice, I think, at a certain point, to say, look, I just don't think we're that happy anymore. I just don't think we're really that compatible with each other because we've gotten older. Our priorities have changed. We don't look as good as we used to. We don't find each other that attractive anymore. Our sex life's basically gone down the pan. And there just comes a point where you just have to say, it's time to move on. I think it's time to just. But at the same time, with that, you have to be careful with that because, you don't want to go into the new relationships with the same kind of naive expectations you had when you started your previous one, and you certainly don't want to carry over into your new relationships any kind of toxicity or dysfunctionalities that ended that relationship. So, you've got to be very careful not to end up in a cycle of repeats, of because it is down to both people to try and make a relationship work, to try and keep it healthy, to try and keep it engaging. Because once somebody starts to feel that they're no longer valued, that they're no longer seen in that relationship, and certainly as a man, that they're certainly not seen as a respectable individual or someone that's appreciated anymore, then that man then checks out. That man, once the trust and respect has gone, as far as the man's concerned, and if it actually has, because the partner's confirmed it, then that's game over for that relationship. That's doomed. That's finished. There's no way back from that, really. And so I think for a lot of men, they find themselves wanting to, I think, at a certain point, spend more time with their friends or doing certain sports or going to the gym more to try and cope because, they're unhappy in their private, personal lives with their women, and so they end up overcompensating by, taking their kind of misery out on, in some at least relatively healthy ways through whatever it is they're interested in, or maybe they just start spending more time by themselves, going out, whatever it might be, taking small trips away, fishing, spending more time online, gaming, as I said, spending more time with their friends, whether it's online or in person, whatever. And I think a lot of the time, it's a lot of it's down to problems in communication. It's problems it's problems with delusions. It's this sense that our partners are supposed to be everything that we need, and unfortunately that is not the reality of the world. That's not And it's also unfair, really, as well, to expect that this person that you spend virtually every single second, a moment of your life with, is somehow going to fulfill all your wants and needs 24 hours a day. It's not going to happen, And I think when you understand that's when you can at least try to have a bit more of a sustainable relationship with someone. But if you deny it, or you don't realise that, then you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. Yeah, and that applies for women and men. I think women have some delusions of grandeur about themselves because they get kind of put on pedestals. They've been put on pedestals since they were young. It's been told they were princesses and, unique and special, and that and so they grow up with this sense of entitlement, and and they get to pick, naturally they get to pick, the cream of the crop, partly because they can, but also partly because they've built up this egotistical complex within themselves that they are something. They kind of become their own idols, really. They idolize themselves, just simply because they're women, and also because they've been told for years or decades that they are, in some sense, superior to men, and I just don't think that any of that stuff is remotely helpful to women or men. And because it's, we talk a lot, we hear about the glorification, sexualization of women and all that kind of stuff, but in terms of the glorification of femininity, or I would call it a glorification of toxic femininity, because I believe that it exists. I believe that it's a real thing. Just the way just the general way that a lot of women talk down to men, treat men as if they're below them. And yeah, of course, there are a lot of men that treat women like that as well. But I think overall, I think there's a lot more these days. I believe there's a lot more. There just seems to be a lot of double standards. There seems to be a lot of hypocrisy that women can get away with certain things and men shouldn't be allowed to. I mean, just look at the way that pornography is viewed. For example, that if an older man is hitting on some younger woman, then that's kind of seen as gross and unacceptable and disgusting, and that individual has no integrity or no self-respect. But yet, when it's viewed from the angle of a woman that's being lustful and trying to get a young man to find her attractive or engage with her sexually in whatever way, and that's kind of deemed as, oh, well, that's okay, that's acceptable. But and that's just one example. But I just think it's just in general, I think there's a lot of disrespect and devaluing of men from a lot of women. Of course, I'm not saying it's all women. There's a lot of good women out there, obviously. That goes without saying. But I do think there are a lot of women out there that have a very skewed, very kind of this. What's the right way to put it? Just a very kind of manipulative tendencies towards dating, towards romance, towards their femininity and romantic, anything of the kind of romantic nature. I mean, just look at the way that things like OnlyFans work, and I mean, there's so much like. And I think there's so many reasons for it, but one of the main reasons I think that it happens is because women pride themselves on their primarily, I think, and this is not just the problem with men, but women themselves, that they identify more with their attractiveness or their perceived attractiveness more than men think about those things. I think, but of course, men are to some extent visually stimulated creatures, but I think what a lot of women cause themselves a lot of. I think they cause themselves a lot of problems because they put themselves on pedestals and they think that the world should revolve around them and their needs and their emotions and their, naive expectations from men. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't have boundaries. I'm not saying that it shouldn't have standards, but I don't think it is that a lot of the time. I think it's just women treating men like shit. I don't want to swear really, but that is what it is. Women just. I think a lot of women see men as below them. That's what I think, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. But I probably a lot of it comes down to what I call kind of evolutionary baggage. Really, it's this sense that women are supposed to kind of hold on to a lot of these evolutionary advantages, let's say, that had a place in the past with regards to security and safety, and I get it, and that's to some extent, I think it still applies today to a point, but I also think that a lot of it's very counterproductive. Really, it's not. I don't think a lot of it's. I think there's just too much of a market now. Everything's been turned into some form of capitalism or of some sort. Everything's a commodity now. Everything's an asset. And that's what I think really what it boils down to. That women tend to. And again, I emphasise that it's not all women, obviously. I shouldn't even have to say that, but I don't want to come across as being something that I'm not here. But I'm just saying that I think for the most part, whether most women would admit it or not, but I think they see men as an asset. They see men as something to gain from. They see it they see men as an opportunity more than a. I don't think that romance is necessarily the first thing that women. I think women like the notions of romance in terms of how they picture it because of the things that they've seen in movies. But I think deep down they know that a lot of that stuff's kind of wishful thinking, really, and that deep down that they sense that they have to somehow trick men into relationships or manipulate men into relationships for their own needs, for whatever that is, whether that's children, to have children, whether that's because they've got something to gain financially from it, whether it's because there's an opportunity to move somewhere else, to a better area. And I'm not saying that men don't do that as well. I'm sure that a lot of men do, but I think predominantly that comes up. There's a lot more of that stuff going on from women towards men, in my opinion, and it is just that, for what it's worth. And I'm not saying that. I'm not necessarily saying that women are. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that all women are bad. I'm just saying that I think that is part of the nature of a lot of modern women these days. That they see men as. What have I got to gain from being with you? What do you have to offer me? Why should I give up my body for you? Why should I give up my time for you? Why should I give up my energy for you? And they're all valid questions, but it also paints men as you're not worthy type of thing. This kind of mentality that's like, well, you're not worthy to be with me. Who are you? You're nothing. You're a man. You don't. I don't see. You're not on the same level as me. And so therefore, you need to you need to prove yourself or have something to offer me in return for my body, in return for sex, in return for companionship, in return for kids, whatever it might be. And again, I get it, I understand it, because that's part of, to a point anyway, it's part of human nature, I suppose. But it's I don't know, there are just ways of doing things that I don't think you need to be quite as manipulative. I think it would help a lot of women if they were more open and honest about their intentions, and then you could save themselves and others a lot of heartache, a lot of trouble. But I think unfortunately, a lot of women are drawn to that stuff. They're drawn to the drama. They're drawn to the dark side of things, if you like. Probably not the best way to describe it, but I think that they are drawn to a sense of control, a sense of power, and they like having that. And society for the last few decades has basically put a lot of women in a position where they do have that. And women are just riding that wave, because, and I don't necessarily blame them, because we've had centuries of predominantly male rule across most of the world. And so I get it, I understand it, I do, but I also don't think that you have to conform to it all, either, because what essentially, especially in the Western world, society is kind of, indirectly kind of like put a lot of pressure and stress on women to have kids, to settle down, and I think a lot of it probably comes from a backlash of that. That's kind of partly why I think what radical feminism was essentially, probably initially about, was a backlash to some excessive conservative values and less than ideal, expectations of women and the these supposed gender roles that they were supposed to kind of stick to. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I think we have to look at things carefully. We have to have a balance. And I'm not saying that women are bad, but I also don't think that a lot of women are particularly decent either. But then again, just like women, that applies to men as well. If you just give me a second, I'll be back in a moment. I'll be back in about a minute. A lot of women are attracted to drama, they're attracted to gossip, they're attracted to fighting, being argumentative, being confrontational in many respects. And if you just give me a moment, I'll come back and I'll discuss it a bit more about my own experiences. If you just give me one moment, I'll come back. I wasn't planning this, but I just have to do something for a second. Sorry about that. So yeah, like I was saying, I don't think don't think that women are evil necessarily, but I do think that they like being manipulated. They like having a sense of power or control, whether that is in whatever ways that it manifests itself. One way, I believe, is partly through sex, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of it. I think a lot of it comes down to, well, probably several factors, really. One of them is probably, well, I know that one of the main ways I think that women try to exploit men, well, and probably one of the main ways actually, is through toxic femininity. It's through sex, it's through lust, it's through various different forms of manipulation of men in that way. And really, if you want to see that play out, you only have to go and watch a few minutes of your average pornography, and you can see it playing out there. A woman trying to manipulate a man, whether it's a married man, whether it's a single guy, a virgin, whatever it is. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff around today. There's a lot of this older woman type content and younger guy stuff, a lot of that stuff online now. One time it used to be just kind of like, generally speaking, people around the same age, that kind of content, but like now there's a lot of this kind of like what I call like wannabe queen culture stuff like going on now, where you have all of this, and I've seen a lot of it on X with regards to certain kinks and certain fetishes, let's say, that I think women are trying to capitalise off. They're trying to capitalise off men. And while I wouldn't necessarily say that it's trying to get the words out here. I wouldn't say it necessarily it's a bad thing per se, but I don't think it's. I wouldn't exactly say it was moral either. But we do live in a capitalist system. We live in a world where we need money to survive. But it's not so much that I can kind of look past that really. We all want money. We all need resources, and we all want to have a better life, quality of life, and I get it. So it's not that. I'm not a hypocrite. I'm not like saying, oh well, only men should. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that. I just think it's just the way that a lot of these types of content creators, adult content creators, whether it's with main pornography or like I said the kink fetish side of things, it's just a general way that they talk down to men. They just don't see them as. They almost see them as subhuman. They don't even see them as men. They don't even, and I think probably a lot of the time they don't even particularly enjoy what they do. It's just that. They just look at men as a cash cow. They see the DMs and all they think about is money for the most part. In fact, I'm not saying, of course, there'll be obviously content creators that are more empathic and probably really like what they do and enjoy the kind of interactions and meeting new people and that. I'm sure that those people exist, but I think it's more I think a lot of it's the more toxic side of things is probably women of a certain age, probably more in their 20s, really, early 30s, like the kind of like their peak, for the most part, their peak of sexual attractiveness, or sense that mostly for a lot of women their peak of their physical peak, let's say, in terms of attractiveness. So yeah, it's like, I get it. I understand that people, that life's complicated, life's difficult. you know, we all have to have money at some point. We all need to buy things and, you know, get by and exist and try and improve our lives. But I just don't think that it should come at the expense of putting men down or women down, for that matter, because it not only does it damage like men's perceptions of women when women try and belittle men or try to degrade them or try to put them in a box as all, you know, kind of pathetic, lustful, you know, no self-control, impulsive, kind of a animal, if you like. I just don't think that that's necessarily the truth. I think most men maintain a level of self-control that I think most men maintain a certain level of control that you know. I think most men do genuinely try really hard to maintain, you know, and I think, and that's why women try and exploit it. They try and you know, they're basically women prey on men. They try and prey on men's vulnerabilities or what they believe men might have vulnerabilities with, and mostly, like I've already said, I think that they see or they certainly think that most men are weak, that they have no self-control when they see a pretty attractive woman. And while they might have sexual thoughts towards, that doesn't mean that they want to jump in bed with them, or they're going to, you know, do something inappropriate, or you know, sexually assault them or anything like that. Because I don't think most men are like that. You know, I think most men, you know, would like to know you to some extent before they have sex with you. I don't think that most men are animals or savages or, you know, primitive, you know, like, you know, apes or something. I don't think that's the truth. Just like women, there are a variety of men out there. There's a lot of decent men out there. There's a lot, you know, a lot of good men. And there's a lot of assholes. You know, but that again, that applies to women as well. But I think I'd say, you know, of course, men have their own problem. Men can be manipulative and deceiving and, you know, cunning. But I would say, I think in many ways that women, I think overall, tend to have a little bit more of those things, but they express them in different ways as opposed to men. You know, I think men generally try to have mutual agreements, try to have mutual respect. You know, they try to. I think, you know, there's a kind of unwritten, like that thing that Jordan Peterson said about, you know, men kind of trying to be agreeable because otherwise, you know, the consequences of disagreeing to a point or being argumentative to a point leads to violence or the threat of it. Whereas I think with women, because women, we live in societies now, and frankly, you know, rightfully, where it's wrong to assault a woman, abuse a woman, then, you know, women know that they can get away with certain things more, and that's why, you know, that's why there is such an epidemic of you know, domestic violence towards men from women. You know, people don't hear about it a lot, but it's a very real thing, and it might not be. And a lot of domestic abuse towards men, I think a lot of it's emotional, psychological abuse. You know, and it's not acceptable. You know, and women should face the full consequences of the law for that stuff just as much as men do for their role in their you know, horrific abuse of women. You know, so it's like, but they don't. They get a free pass for the most part. You know. And the system is set up to such an extent anyway that it favours, it's in favour, it promotes, you know, the society, our Western society in many respects over the last few decades have promoted double standards, they've promoted hypocrisy, they've promoted certain behaviours and they've become tolerated all the time. And you know, men are basically told to be, you know, there's unspoken kind of parts of society that basically just say, you know, you're supposed to be man, just put up with it, tolerate it, you know, don't say what you think, don't say what you feel, you know, just try and keep your woman happy even though she's making you miserable. Because, you know, we're supposed to maintain this sense of, this image of strength, this image of stability and security for our families, for ourselves, for our own minds, especially keep up this delusion when we're with our closest friends and family that everything's fine, everything's okay. And I think a lot of the time, you know, I think a lot of men, I don't think they are okay. There's a reason why so many men get so addicted to the gym, or get so addicted to gambling, or addicted to alcoholism, you know, so addicted to affairs and things like that. And it's like, I'm not saying that any of that stuff is I don't think that's none of that stuff is healthy, really, but you know, all that stuff comes with its own problems, set problems, which can also feed into sometimes, you know, why. I'm not saying that I'm not trying to sit here and say that men are perfect, because men can be their own worst enemies in their own ways, and men cause problems in their own marriages and relationships as well, just as much as women do. So I'm acknowledging that. But I think generally speaking, I think men really do try hard to please and satisfy their women. I really believe that. I genuinely do. They go to all sorts of extremes to try and make their partner happy, their woman happy. There's all sorts of things that men would do for women that women would never do for that would never ever do for men. Creating things, building things, you know, getting themselves in debt, you know, working themselves to death, you know, getting dirty, you know, getting almost to the point of breaking point because of all the demands and expectations that are placed upon them at work and then at home and with the kids. You know, they're expected to stick by, you know, that woman until the kids have grown up, and most men do that. But the fact is that most men don't need to do that. They could easily just walk away if they want to, but most men don't do that. And that tells me that men have integrity, they have self-respect. They do care about them, they care about the kids. But I think men get tired of the games, they get tired of the cock-blocking bullshit, they get tired of the manipulative little games that they have to put, that they're supposed to put up with their wife or their partner. Whether it's trying to make them jealous over something, whether it's trying to make them angry, trying to irritate them, deliberately trying to do so, to try and back them into a corner, to prove to themselves some fucked up notion that this person is what they think, what they felt and thought all along. You know, they've already got some assumptions about you that have got no basis in reality, they've got no evidence for, and they're just always at you all the time. You know, they're just constantly at you, bombarding you with bullshit, you know, with things that you don't care about. But you're expected to just pretend all the time that you care about every little thing they say. It just gets tiring. And then they wonder why you get pissed off with them. They wonder why you get bored of them, because they just don't leave you alone. Sometimes it's like they don't leave you alone with. It's always just bullshit and crap that you don't care about, and that they know you don't care about. But they're just like the women like to push your buttons. They like to see how far they can push you. Many women in many respects are a bit like overgrown teenagers. You know, they like testing the boundaries. They like seeing. They like breaking you down. That's what I think. Because in many ways I think they feel threatened by you. They feel threatened by your presence. They feel threatened by the very nature that you are as a man. They don't like it because I think a lot of women, they're not content with who they are. Now I don't know why that is, but that's my experience. That they're just never content with who they are. They can never be alone with their own thoughts, themselves for too long. They've always got to have some distraction, some kind of support mechanism all the time, something to. They can't you just can't accept that sometimes you just want to have silence. You just want to be left alone sometimes. But when it comes to things that matter, when it comes to things that are really important, like intimacy and connection and loyalty and respect, they don't seem to care about those things as much. And I think it's because women have different priorities to it. Women only love you, I think, with conditions, with either unwritten or written in some way conditions. That you have to meet a certain checklist, you have to meet a certain number of expectations and requirements if you want this or that. Now, that doesn't. I'm not saying that men shouldn't have responsibility and be accountable to a point in their relationships. Of course they should. Everybody involved in a relationship should be responsible and play their part. But that's the problem. You can't have a healthy relationship where the foundations aren't on an equal footing, really, for the most part. There are always going to be differences between men and women. That'll forever be the case, I would imagine. But I think it's that I think men want to be loved. They want to be taken care of. They want to feel wanted. They want to feel a connection with their partner. But the problem is that women expect men to be something that they're not, and probably men do the same thing towards women. So that's the problem. Or it's all going well initially when when you're in that short-lived phase of heightened emotions and the magical phase of the beginning of a relationship or a potential relationship or something. Because you kind of let your guard down. It's like you don't really care because you're so obsessed with, let's face it, in many ways, jumping into bed with that person, that you overlook all the other stuff. Because we are initially drawn to each other. Well, certainly from a man's perspective, a man is drawn to a woman for a lot of reasons, but I think initially they are drawn to a woman's looks, her height, her skin tone, how a man perceives, how a woman's sort of sensitivities and all that kind of stuff. Because obviously, from an evolutionary perspective, there's an unconscious desire for those qualities to be, for one to want to have those qualities in their children, and so from a woman's perspective, they also have a similar kind of thing, but I think there's less of it. I think for a woman, really, she's looking at a man thinking, and of course she has to be attracted to him as well. I'm not denying that fact, but I think the main attractiveness of a man to a woman really is what he has to potentially offer her. And I think that women will only let their guard down, if you like, or put the barriers down to her, because essentially it's a form of currency, isn't it? That's what it is. A woman's sexuality or a woman's body really is a form of currency to men in many respects. So it's always about it's always about like it's a transaction more than anything else. I think with I'd say the vast majority of women it's a transactional thing. And yeah, there are certainly transactional aspects from that men want something in return, whether that's eventually to have children, because obviously there's a lot of unspoken expectations, unspoken thoughts and feelings from either side. Nobody's going to be completely open and honest about what they want and what they potentially want from the other person off the bat. Nobody really does that. And so, people end up in relationships where they never really truly knew or know why they got together at all, really, apart from the kind of surface level stuff. But deep down, that woman might be thinking, well, he's got a nice car, he's got a decent job, so he's gonna be bringing money in. We're gonna have regular holidays. I'm gonna be able to have my kids with this person, because essentially for a lot of women that they're thinking about whether that's seriously or just sort of in passing or unconsciously, subconsciously, they're thinking about the potential for children. Again, not all women, some women don't want to have children, some women never do have children. So, I'm not trying to say it's everyone, but I think, if you look at it from an evolutionary point of view, it's pretty. It's not a controversial point to make, is it? I think that women do have that innate desire, at least probably up to a point anyway in their life, to want to have children, or at least think about the possibility of having children. And so they're on the lookout for what they perceive as the best genetics, the best resources that they can get from someone. And that's why they see men as they like the aspect of competition. They like the fact, they like men fighting over them. They like men drooling over them in some way. But at the same time, they're kind of repulsed. I think women have a very difficult relationship with men, because on the one hand they want them because they see them as as potentially sources of multiple opportunities or potential opportunities. But on the other hand, they kind of, I think in some ways, are repulsed by them. They might not necessarily find that as attractive as they might let on, but they know deep down that there are certain things that a man wants, or maybe not desperate for, but would like. That they it's essentially it's kind of a game of poker, really. It's a thing of it's a kind of bluff type thing. It's a I'm only going to reveal my cards and reveal my true agenda when it suits me, when I feel, and essentially what women try to do is they try to, convince men to, treat men in a certain way and convince men up to a certain point where men are then thinking, well, this is the person that I think cares about me, I think loves me. Because of the way that, you see, men. The problem with men is that they often, because men aren't typically emotional creatures, that everything gets kind of like pummeled into love, really, and so when men feel that stuff, they believe it all. They believe that that's all real and it's all, well, it must be true because I feel it, rather than it just being a kind of natural reaction, or like a kind of impulse type, like a kind of reflex type, psychological type of thing. And men get sucked in by it. They get drawn into it. It's like a form of magnetism. It's hard. It's like a gravity, and it's hard to escape from. And women know that. They know that stuff. They're aware of it. And so again, this is one. From a, again, I keep saying it, but from an evolutionary angle, it makes sense, because that's how you secure. That's how you get security. That's how you potentially get security and stability and safety from a man, because typically, throughout the history of our species, that is how it's happened. Because women generally perceive men as a protector of their safety and their children's, whereas a man perceives, typically, that is, a man would generally perceive a woman as a form of comfort, as a form of emotional stability, as a form of loyalty, as a companion, not just for children, but to connect with someone on a level that he can't connect with in that way with anybody else. A man can't connect with his friends the same way emotionally, romantically, as he can with his partner, obviously, because that's not how it works. Generally speaking, that is. So it is difficult. It's a complicated, very complex series of factors involved in this all, and I don't think that women are necessarily kind of. I don't think women are necessarily malicious. It might be a bit of an exaggeration to say malicious, but I definitely think that women like to. They like to play games because it suits their needs. It gives them a sense of empowerment, and on that point of empowerment, I think women have been told for decades that dressing in a certain way, looking a certain way is a form of empowerment, and maybe to some extent there is some truth to that. But I think on a deeper human level, I just think that I think so many women buy into things that they don't realise is not actually that, is not. They don't see. I don't think some women don't quite see how they're being manipulated. They don't realise how they're manipulating themselves through believing in all that kind of garbage. It's like, if you want to look good, if you want to wear makeup, you want to wear whatever clothes you want, fine, whatever. I couldn't give a fuck really. But I don't think you should necessarily sit there and call it, that's the epitome of female empowerment or something. There's nothing wrong with women wanting to, express herself through makeup or a certain fashion. But I think, in and of itself, I think that's. I think it's probably more of a coping mechanism, really. That's probably born out of a lot of internal identity-related factors, probably. Insecurities of one kind or another, because women, because their attractiveness typically is associated with their beauty, their youthfulness, if you like. That's how their inner world is built around that, and that might work up until the point of say 35 and 40, something like that. But then, once you past your kind of physical attractiveness peak, it's like that stuff doesn't really. It's not as effective anymore. And I'm sure there are a lot of women out there that realise that. They know that they've been played by marketing companies, advertisements, since they were bloody prepubescent teens or whatever, and they've been told that they have to look a certain way or dress a certain way, smell a certain way, because that's liberation. That's freedom. That's independence. That's empowerment. And maybe it is to a point. I'm not denying that it doesn't at least have some kind of truth to it to a certain degree. But I don't think it's the entire picture. To me, from my own experiences, what I find attractive in a woman, for me, is, well, yes, it's looks, but it's also, it's a way that a woman talks to you. It's a way that a woman treats you. It's not just. In fact, it's a lot. It's not even. I would say a lot of the time, it's not even just for for me, it's not even just purely how a woman looks, because I can find a woman physically attractive, you know, and I might think to myself, you know, I would quite like to engage in sexual intercourse with that individual, but like at the same time, her personality sucks, you know, her attitude stinks, you know, she's just not that much of an interesting individual. She's too shallow, she's too superficial. And I'm sure, you know, I'm sure people probably thought that about me, you know, I'm sure, you know, so it's a two-way thing, you know, it can apply from both ends. So I think we have to be careful when we talk about relationships and romance and compatibility, and you know, again, I'll repeat what I said at the start. You know, I'm not saying that it's all women. Everything I've said, it doesn't apply to all women. Not everything I've said applies to all about men. That I've talked about applies to all men. Of course, you know, I shouldn't even have to just like keep repeating these kind of things. But you know, there's always this worry that someone's going to call you, you know, a sexist, or you know, you've got such, you know, misogynistic views. It's like, I don't actually. I think I have a fairly kind of middle ground, fairly grounded kind of approach to things for the most part. I'm not saying I'm absolutely correct on everything I say, but I do think that I've definitely, yeah, I try to cover some nuances. I try not to go to one extreme view or the other really, but but at the same time I can only speak of what I think is the reality of certain things that I'm talking about, based on my own interpretations of the world, based on my own observations of women, not just in relationships, but when I was single, and just generally just like observing things and interpreting things, and just kind of trying to understand the world around me, just understand why people are the way they are, and what's really going on, as best as I possibly can. And again, I'm not a scholar, you know, I don't know everything, but you know, it doesn't matter really. It's like I'm just giving my own opinions about things. If nothing else, you know, just see it as that. They are just my opinions. I'm not stating them as facts. I'm just saying this is my interpretation based on my own observations and the things that I've come to, my own sort of semi kind of conclusions that I've come to. I'm not saying they're absolute. I'm not saying that it's evidence. I'm just saying that these are things that I've thought of. These are my own views on these things. And as someone that's been I was in a fairly long-term, sort of semi-relationship, if you like, in my last relationship, and someone that's been married since 2019, and I've been in this relationship since, really I think it was mid to late December 2016, so I've been married. I've been in a relationship with the same woman now for almost 10 years. You know, I've learned some stuff. You know, I've learned that you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. Really. You shouldn't go into a relationship thinking that this person is the cure for my life, because you will sadly be very mistaken very quickly, and you will set yourself up for a lot of disappointment and a lot of disillusionment. And you might be thinking, well, maybe that's why you have some of the views you do towards them, and that might be true. You know? But I believe that I have confidence in the things that I'm saying, otherwise I wouldn't say them. Because at the end of the day, what matters is that you say what you really, what you mean. You say what you believe in. You know, even if you're wrong, you know, at least you're having some kind of integrity. You know, by being honest about what you really think and feel about these kind of difficult topics that people don't want to talk about. These difficult, sometimes controversial, sometimes divisive, sometimes very kind of controversial, difficult topics, because it's so easy these days to have labels thrown at you, and people to judge you based on one thing you said. And it's like, well, did you listen to the rest of everything I said? Because in context of everything else, it would make sense. But if you just pick out one tiny little thing I said, then yeah, of course it makes me look like an asshole. But I'm not an asshole. I think I try my best to be as decent a human being as I can. But I've made mistakes. I'm not perfect. And nobody is. And that's the problem with relationships. We go into relationships thinking that the other person's perfect. And they're not. They're just a human being. They're a mess of imperfections. They're a mess of insecurities. They're a mess of various forms of baggage that they carry with them. Whether it's from previous relationships, whether it's with difficult relationships with their parents, their siblings, friendships, things that didn't work out in life, whatever it might be. Everyone's a bundle of different fuck-ups, disappointments, various delusions even, various biases, various perceptions of the opposite sex that might have some basis in reality, but it's not entirely true. So, we're all deeply flawed human beings, and I think that admitting that is a good place to start when it comes to relationships, because if you go into a relationship thinking that person is somehow some saving grace for you and get all of your problems and all of your insecurities, and that person's never going to say anything that makes you uncomfortable or is going to offend you, then you might as well just not bother. You might as well stay single, because over time, trust me, they will say things about you. They will tell you, if they. Hopefully they care about you and love you, and so they will tell you the truth. But also, sometimes, people can go too far, and some people can just have a string of, or a period of just being insulting, just being rude, just being unpleasant towards you, because they don't love you anymore, because they don't care about you anymore, they want rid of you, but they just don't, or they can't, or they need you for something, or they want you for some reason. So they can't get rid of you. And so, and that's the thing as well, is that people will only, generally speaking, only want you in their lives if they think that there's something there to gain from you somewhere along the line, whether it's in the short term or it's in the long term, or it's a trade-off, or it's a compromise of some sort, It's very, very, very rare that you're ever going to be with someone, purely out of some kind of like moral duty or something, some kind of, sort of ethically bound, morally bound type of connection or drive towards something. Really, it's like those things are extremely rare. For the most part, it's essentially a business deal. I think I've touched upon. I may have touched upon this actually before in another video. I can't remember now. I've made so many, but all I'm saying, look, is that relationships are difficult. Relationships are complicated, and you're not always going to get what you want out of them. You're not always going to get what you need out of someone. And sometimes those things only occur to you. You only realise that stuff when you're, already in a few years, and you've become attached to that individual, and it's just, you're just setting yourself up for misery. And that's why I think if you're going to go into a relationship, you need to have, I think this is why you need to have a certain degree of maturity. You need to have a certain level of, I think, of life experience, really, before you go into a relationship. You need to live a bit first. You need to have developed yourself a little bit and understood a bit about yourself, and that's why my previous relationship didn't work out, because I was too young, and I was basically, it's kind of an overgrown teenager, really, in many ways. And relationships can only work when you understand that the other person standing in front of you is just as messed up as you are, but maybe just in different ways. It's all good. It's all good and well being romantic and having that lovey-dovey kind of stuff, and that's great. It's as someone who's experienced it myself, it's great to have a flood of emotions and go through the kind of fiery kind of period of lust and the riding that high of that 6 months or a year long process of kind of getting to know each other and getting to know each other's bodies, getting to know each other's thoughts and habits and opinions and beliefs, over generally speaking, although you might never know exactly everything about someone, but you'll get an idea of what someone's like over a period of time. And that's great, that's a wonderful thing, but I think you just have to be careful how you approach it and not to I think you have to just not give yourself so much of yourself to that other person. Don't lay yourself out on a bloody cross for that person necessarily. Don't just... I think you need to be aware that that person has flaws and that they can't be everything that you want them to be all the time. They've got their own shit going on, they've got their own complicated inner world, they've got their own complicated personalities and traumas and, like I said, baggage. Their own fears, their own ambitions, their own dreams, their own annoyances, their own irritating habits, like just as you do. There are going to be things that you like about that person over time more. There are certainly going to be things that you kind of almost despise in some ways, Not hate, don't hate, but you certainly don't like about that certain aspects of their personality, certain parts, certain thoughts, certain beliefs, certain opinions that they have. Whether it's about you or your family or your friends, what your job, whatever it might be, how much money you make. And so, over time, the longer that you stay with somebody, the harder it is to stay together. That is just a fact. That's what I've learned as someone that's been in the same relationship now since 2016, late 2016. So, it's not always easy. Trust me, it's not always easy to, it's hard work. It's hard work sticking with the same person for a long time. It's hard work tolerating the same person's habits and the same boring rhetoric and small talk and cycles of certain petty remarks or petty arguments or whatever. But that is, I think that's just a part and parcel of being a human being. It's not this. It's not, relationships aren't this sort of like euphoric, ethereal like experience like all the time. Just as life isn't, relationships are a reflection of life really in many respects, because life isn't perfect. It's deeply flawed in many ways, but there are moments of joy, there are moments of beauty in it. There are moments to be thankful for, there are moments to have gratitude for, there are moments where you learn something new, or experience something new, but there are times when life becomes repetitive and tedious and annoying and boring and difficult. And you think to yourself, what the fuck am I doing in this relationship? Why am I still here? Why am I bothering? I don't feel like there's anything here anymore. But then, within a few days or a few weeks or a few months, something happens and you think, actually, it is worth it. It is all worth all of this shit. It is worth staying here. But then again, you'll go through that cycle where nothing spectacular happens for a while, and then something great happens. And that's what happens over time in relationships. And that's what people can't tolerate. That's what people don't like, because they think that they go into relationships thinking that honeymoon period, as they call it, that's exactly how it's going to be for the remainder of that relationship, and it's not. It is not. And that is a tough lesson that you'll have to learn. There's going to be times where you're going to have serious arguments, serious fallouts. There are going to be times where you're almost at each other's throats, But then you'll come back together, you'll reconnect, and everything will be alright for a few weeks or a few months. But then you'll have another argument at some point over something, because that's what happens when you're around the same person, virtually day in, day out. And that's why I don't think that most relationships work out in the long term, because most people don't know how to navigate that stuff. Most people they're never taught how to navigate that kind of stuff. You just get pushed into adulthood, whether you like it or not. And that's it, you're on your own. Tough luck, kid, you're thrown in at the deep end, and you better fucking figure it out very quickly. That's the reality of being an adult. You might get the occasional bit of advice from your parents or your siblings or whoever. If you're lucky, you might have a mentor, you might meet someone who becomes a kind of mentor-like friend, someone with a bit more life experience than you. But for the most part, you're on your own in this world, You've got to figure shit out on your own. You've got to make mistakes, and you better bloody learn from them, because some of them can be bloody costly. So your psychological well-being, your emotional well-being, your financial situation, just your life in general. And if you're making a fuck ups, that's it. Your life's finished, and it'll be hard to come back from. And that's what makes being in a relationship with somebody after a period of time extremely difficult. Because as life goes on anyway, even without being in a relationship, life gets harder, because you're getting older, you don't feel as well as you do, you don't look as good as you did, you don't feel as good about yourself because you don't look as good as you did. Your brain's starting to slow down, your metabolism's fucking in ruins. And life becomes harder for you. Whether it's your health declining, whether it's people, dying, whether it's in your family, your friendships, whatever. You're getting tired of your job. You get tired. You don't really want to work anymore because you're getting older. You don't have the energy. You don't have the capacity to tolerate certain degrees of bullshit from people anymore. You kind of become a bit more miserable, a bit more irritable about life because you're getting older, and you're not as resilient as you used to be. So there's all that shit that gets thrown onto people from being a human being anyway. And then you've got all of the extra pressures and stresses of being in a relationship with someone, especially in a long-term one, that adds even more things to it. And it piles it on people, and you can understand why people get tired of each other. You can understand why people want to separate, why people get divorced, why people end up practically hating each other, And I don't blame people sometimes, I get it, I get it, I understand where that intolerance at a certain point comes from. I understand where that bitterness and resentment and anger and frustration and disappointment and disillusionment with everything that we got told were great things, wonderful things about life, they kind of crush you at certain points if you're not careful. So, you have to be realistic. You have to be realistic about how you have to be honest with yourself. About the way you look, your attractiveness to the opposite sex or to the same sex, whatever. Your situation, your financial bracket, your job, your personality, your character, your views, etc., etc., etc. You've got to be fucking brutally honest with yourself and say, look, I'm not a bloody perfect human being. I'm a deeply flawed individual that not everyone's going to like. Not everyone's going to understand me properly. Not everyone cares and gives a fuck about who I am, what I have to say. They don't want to know. They don't want to they don't want to listen. And that applies to relationships if you're not careful. And don't get me wrong. I loved my ex. I loved her to pieces. I really did. I really mean that. I love that woman to bits, but it didn't work. You know, we tried, but it just didn't work. And that is sad. You know, that does upset me sometimes. You know, because I did try, but it just didn't work out. You know, it just did. We tried, I think, but we were just too different. And because of those differences, that led to frustration, that led to resentment and bitterness. And so I ended up having an affair. You know, she was breathing down my neck basically virtually every day. We were at each other's necks even before the affair happened. Which partly is one of the reasons. I don't want to keep going on about this bullshit. You know, it was years ago, but just to get it out there, I had an affair because it was born out of that shit. Do I accept part of it was down to opportunity? Yes. But a lot of it was just down to that I didn't feel any connection in the relationship anymore. She was at my throat every other day. And we just hated each other. And I regret that. I regret that shit. You know, I really genuinely do. You know, I didn't want things to pan out that way. I didn't want for things to end on those terms. I could see how heartbroken she was when I left. And you know, and that made me feel like a fucking terrible, shitty human being. And so it should have done. Like everybody else, I have regrets. I made mistakes. I'm not a perfect human being, far from it. But I only did it because there was nothing left at that point. There was nothing left of the relationship. It was over. It had been over for weeks, if not even months. We weren't sleeping together anymore. You know, we weren't even sleeping in the same bed anymore, let alone having sexual intercourse with each other. Not that I should divulge in that type of stuff, but just for the record. And so that came to an end. You know, that was the end of that chapter. That was a failed if you like, a kind of failed, you know, initiation into the world of being an adult in a romantic relationship. It didn't, you know, I made mistakes and I regret them, but I did make mistakes. And I have to live with that. I have to accept that I played my part in the end of that relationship. But also, you know, I can't just gloss over the fact that she didn't help as well. She made her own mistakes, and she knows that. You know, I still care about her. I don't have any ill will towards her anymore. You know, it's like, for a period of time, I pretty much hated her guts, but I don't anymore. Do I want to see her again? Probably not. You know, but I don't wish her any harm. I wish her a good health and good life. But you know, sometimes it bothers me, that kind of stuff. You know, and part of me does still love her, I suppose, in a way. You know, and I always will do. Because she came into my life at a time when, you know, I needed someone, I suppose. But it was just the wrong time. It was the right time in many ways, because otherwise it would never have happened. But in terms of the long term and compatibility, it just wasn't right. The things just didn't line up. You know, the stars didn't align. It just wasn't going to work. And so, you know, that all led to the end of that, and then I ended up meeting my wife, and you know, and that was just a whole other level of complication and bullshit at the time when all that began, because I was still living with my ex, and again, I'm not proud of it. You know, I wish this shit didn't happen. I wish things didn't pan out the way that they did. But I accept that is my past, that is my history, and I'm willing to open up about it. I'm not proud of what I've done. I don't you know, wake up thinking, I'm a fucking great human being, and I'm you know, I've got this overblown ego or something, because I'm not like that. I have regrets, and I really do feel for my ex. I really do feel that I could have done things differently. I should have been more amicable. I should have been more mature. I should have, you know, dealt with things in a different way, but I didn't. And that's shit that I have to live with for my life. And I don't think about it 24 hours a day, but when I do think about it, you know, it angers me, it upsets me, because It didn't need to be like that, but it was. You know, and I think truthfully, the reason I bring up that stuff is because to some extent, some of the issues of that relationship carried through to my current relationship. You know, me and my wife, we haven't always got on. We've had arguments. We have our differences of opinion. We're very different, extremely different, I'd say, people in many respects. We have some things in common, granted, but you know, we both love each other. You know, I love my wife very deeply. I really do, and she loves me in her own way. But it's a different kind of love. It's expressed differently. And again, you know, this goes into everything I've been talking about. That people express their love, appreciation, gratitude, intimacy in different ways, and that. And if you know, again, you might not always like how other people deal with those things. You know, not everyone's comfortable being intimate. Not everyone's comfortable, you know, doing the things that you want because that's what you like. And again, that's another hard lesson that you have to learn. That just because you like something doesn't mean you're going to get it. Just because you want something doesn't mean you're going to get it. And that doesn't just apply to a relationship, that just applies to life in general. Whether it's that job you want, you know, whether it's, you know, a loan you want, whether it's having kids, but things just didn't work out, you couldn't get someone pregnant, or you just didn't meet the right person, you know, you didn't get that promotion you wanted. You couldn't maintain a certain friendship with someone for whatever reasons, you know. And life is a series of disappointments. It's a series of realizations that aren't always pleasant to accept, that aren't always pleasant to have to confront and really say to yourself, I don't like this truth, but at least it is the truth. And especially about yourself. You know, the more that you know about yourself, the more that you're willing to open up and be truly, truly real with yourself in life, and especially in relationships, the more that you will be a better partner. If you meet somebody that's, you know, when people say the right person, I don't like that kind of language, because it almost kind of, it has this kind of, it's an exaggerated statement. You know, I don't think that there is a right person for you. There's more, let's say there's a more ideal, let's say a more ideal, compatible person for you. More ideal than other people. Let's put it that. I think that's probably a better way to put it. But you're never gonna really, for the most part, unless you're exceptionally lucky. And these, you know, there are couples out there that have kind of pretty much found the right, you know, roughly someone that's got the kind of just about the right kind of the levels of compatibility with them. But I said for the most part, you know, most people are with people that they're probably either not compatible with, people that just settled down with, people that they're kind of like, you know, they kind of feel like that there's a balance there between their own issues or own insecurities and the other person's, that kind of like, there's a kind of yin-yang type thing going on, you know, there's a kind of smoothing out of personalities to some extent or something, you know, of smoothing out of people's imperfections and insecurities. Sometimes it's difficult to know what to say, you know, because I'm just, you know, that's why I say things like you know, because I'm thinking on the spot. You know, don't get me wrong, don't get it, don't misinterpret my words, you know, don't misinterpret my agenda here or something. You know, I'm not. You know, women are amazing. Women do great things. Women are great in many respects. I don't think You couldn't have, obviously it goes without saying, you couldn't have a society without women. You couldn't have a world without women. But I also think you couldn't have a world without men as well. We do, as much as we might not like to admit it, we need each other for all sorts of different reasons, And I think that's a great thing. I love women for all sorts. I love my mother. I love my sister. I love my wife. I love my ex. I've loved my girlfriends I've had in the past. At the time, and there are many great women around the world doing fabulous, great things. Whether it's in their jobs, careers. Scientists, writers, artists, politicians, etc. And there are many, many great women in all walks of life, just as there are many great, fantastic men in walks in there, whatever they're doing, So there are great, wonderful things about both men and women. But my point in this video is that in the context of relationships, it's complicated and it gets messy very quickly when you start diving a bit deeper into the motivations and the agenda of what's really going on in relationships. Again, I don't think women are bad or evil. I just think that they've been misguided. They've been manipulated for so long, and so they express themselves in ways, I think, that's in my opinion, a lot of them not very mature, is not very classy towards men. And I think some of it's born out of what they perceive as kind of, systems of oppression, when I don't think that's really the case at all. I think, there's always been decent men throughout history. There's always been efforts by men to change things for the betterment of women, not just men. And let's not forget that a lot of men throughout history have suffered under the oppression of female leaders as well, queens. Let's not pretend that a matriarchy would somehow be a utopia, because I don't think it would be. It would have probably just as many problems, if not more so, than a patriarchy. So, I think we have to be honest about these things. And look, of course, there are nuances to things I've said throughout this video. I haven't covered every aspect of everything I wanted to say, but I think you've got the general overview of it. Women matter, but men matter as well. And I don't want to continue to see a society where women are at each other's throats because of the way they perceive men, or women are at men's throats. I've got some, very disturbing, twisted sense of morality of dating or romance or sex or so-called empowerment and things like this, when I just wish that people would just try and be a bit more decent to each other, and try and be a bit more kind, or just try and be a bit more honest but respectful to each other. And if you're not happy in a relationship or marriage, as sometimes, I admit that I haven't always been happy in my marriage. I think that goes without saying if you check through my videos on YouTube. I've mentioned a few things before about it, but I think I've really tried. I did try very hard in my previous relationship. I really did, but sometimes it's just not always enough to love someone. It's just not always enough to give everything of yourself to someone, because they don't want everything. They don't always want what you think that they want of you. They don't always respect certain things that you do for them, and I just think that's just an incredible shame, really, and that's where problems start. I think if there was more mutual respect and understanding and empathy and compassion between couples, especially long-term marriages, long-term partnerships, then I think things would be better. I think we would have a much healthier society. And while there are certainly, I'm sure, a lot of couples out there that really try their best, sometimes it's just not enough. It's just, human nature is just so deeply rooted in all sorts of contradictions and ironies, and
complexities of various forms, then it's difficult. It's difficult to navigate a relationship. It's difficult to navigate other human beings' ideas and outlooks and wants and needs all the time, and and this I think from a lot of men's perspective, from a lot of men's perspectives, they have this notion they have to make a woman happy, and somehow that, and also that I think from a woman's perspective that a man is somehow supposed to be the source of their happiness all the time, and this bullshit, these bullshit attitudes and beliefs, they don't help anybody. They don't help anybody at all. That's what creates. That's why people become unhappy and miserable, and disconnected on an emotional level. That's why communication breaks down all the time. Just try and be honest and real with each other. Tell each other what you really think. Tell each other how you really feel about each other, and don't just continue living on as if you've got forever, because you haven't, because time's running out, and you don't want to be stuck in an unhappy relationship forever. As someone that's been through periods of unhappiness, I can tell it's not fucking pleasant. There are times where I've wanted to get the fuck out of this marriage. Trust me. There are times when I just thought to myself, what the fuck am I doing in this relationship? Why did I marry you? I'm sure, I have no doubt that she's thought the same things at times. Thinks, oh God is talking about this again. Good God is doing that annoying thing again. Good God is getting on my nerves. He's irritating. I have no doubt. But you know what? We kept trying. And like that Queen song, is it called Bijou or something like that? We'll keep on trying. And we really have really tried hard to keep this thing going. But I tell you, man, it's hard work sometimes. So you better find things, you better find reasons to want to stay together. Your happiness really comes down to in many ways, to yourself. Yes, of course, other people's actions can have an impact on it. I'm not saying that isn't part of happiness as well, but I think at least being content with yourself, that really comes down to your it's part of a natural process, I think, but it's also the things that you do, the way that, probably to some extent, the way you think, and the way that you regulate your emotions and thoughts and stuff. And so you have to find what things give you a sense of liberation, of freedom and independence in relationships, because that matters probably more so than companionship and spending time with each other. That matters so much. So that you've got things to talk about, so you've got things to share, you've got something that glues your relationship together. Because if you build it on shaky foundations, it's not going to work, is it? If you just base a relationship purely on the way somebody looks, it just doesn't work. Get to know each other. Talk to each other. Have difficult conversations. Talk about interesting things. Have deep discussions. Don't hide things away from each other. Because all it does is it just comes to bite you on the ass eventually, all that kind of stuff. How you really truly feel, what you really genuinely thinking about. Tell each other, talk to each other, communicate. Because if you don't, then you will find yourself getting a divorce. You will find yourself being single again, you know. And then you'll find yourself looking for something in another person that you had in somebody else, or something that you didn't get from somebody else. You start looking for it in somebody else. So, you know, wisdom is so important to learn. It's so important to just say, where did things go wrong and why? You know, how did my role, what did I do in that situation that made things worse? Like, how did I, instead of just playing the victim all the time, you have to say, well, look, at some point, somewhere along the line, I did some things that played a part in the deterioration of this relationship, or in its complete decline. You know, it's like, because only when you start to have accountability for yourself, take responsibility for your own actions, thoughts and feelings, can you move forward in a healthy way. But if you constantly live in a state of denial, which I sometimes think a lot of women tend to do for all sorts of reasons, and men do in different ways as well, you know, you become your own worst enemy. And if you're your own worst enemy, then, you know, people are going to pick up on that, because people pick up on things. They pick up on the way that you behave, your little social, you know, certain cues, body language, the way that your tone of voice, you know, the people read between the lines. People can pick up on certain emotions, and, you know, people are a lot more perceptive than you think they are. Or at least they should be. You know, just before I go, you know, it's like, I think that you have to get off this, we have to remove our egos off. We have to keep our egos in check. We have to get off our high horses from time to time. You know, we have to, you know, quit this kind of entitlement shit. You know, we have to quit this victimhood stuff. We have to, you know, we really have to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, you know, if things aren't working, or things aren't working as well as they should be, you've got to say to yourself, look, where did it go wrong? Or where did things start to go sour, and why? And instead of just pointing the finger at the other person, or at society, or whatever it might be, and I'm not saying that there aren't factors involved in the part of the reasons why you are the way you are, but at some point you have to also accept that you've also done things that didn't help yourself either. And how those things bleed over into you know, deeply intimate parts of relationships that matter to you, and over time suddenly, you know, degrade for whatever reasons, and then you start thinking to yourself, well, what's left of this relationship? What's left of this marriage? You know, if there's, because if you're not getting what you want out of it anymore, then either you need to change your ideas about what you want, or you need to get out of that relationship and find somebody else that's willing to give you what you want. You know, that's what it boils down to in the end. You know, if you're not happy with your current partner, then unfortunately, you know, you're going to have to, you know, figure out some kind of a solution to it. Because the last thing you want to do is spend the next decade of your life arguing it away, being hostile to each other, putting each other down all the time. That's no way to live a life, is it? You know, is that what you want? You want to live a life of misery? I've seen it played out. I saw it play out in my parents' lives. I don't want that shit. I don't want to live a life like that. You know, I would rather just be on my own than be miserable. If the relationship's not serving your needs anymore, then you have to reevaluate them, or you have to think to yourself, well, maybe I'm better on my own. You're better off on my own, or spend a bit of time working on yourself, and figure out what you think is right for you, and then go looking for it, or wait for it to find you, because sometimes opportunities can present themselves, and you might find someone more compatible with you that way. It's not always about you just, and that's the problem, with a lot of modern kind of dating, that we're expected as men to chase after women all the time. But it's our job to chase after them. That's our job to be assertive and take the lead, and be the confident one, and be the kind of put our egos out there, at least until we feel comfortable and stable enough with someone, to find someone. But again, you have to be careful what you're looking for. You don't want to necessarily have a reflection of who you are. You don't necessarily want someone that's too different from you. It's a difficult world navigating potential romantic relationships, because you don't want to attract the wrong type of person for you. You don't want to take on a repeat, as I already mentioned, and you don't want to be, kind of putting certain pressures and motives and unfulfilled expectations out on other people that might have the same things as you do. And I think the best thing you could do is to, as early as you possibly can, and as best as you can, respectfully as you can, is to say, this is what I want, but these are my boundaries, these are my expectations. And as a man, that is, I think men need to be more assertive about what they want, and lay down some barriers and boundaries, and say, I'm not willing to tolerate this type of behaviour. I'm not going to sit here and be treated like shit. I'm not going to be talked down to. I'm not going to be condescended to. I'm not going to be patronised. I'm not going to be played. I'm not going to be used. I'm not going to be manipulated. As best as I can, avoid those type of things. And if I get a sniff of that stuff going on, I won't have anything more to do with it. Because so many men, and probably why women tend to be the way they are, is because men don't set boundaries. They're so desperate, they're so weakened by their own sexual needs in many respects. Not all men, no, but I think so many men are so sexually deprived that they're so desperate to get sex that it clouds their judgment, it clouds their ability to think clearly about things and to think things through. And so they get desperate and they cling on to anything that comes along their way, even if it's not healthy, it's not functional for them, it's not right for them. And then they get settled, and then they get used to the abuse. They get used to a life of mediocrity. They get used to a life of tediousness and repetitiveness. And and the part of being predictable, but it becomes toxic, it's a very toxic dynamic. And people can spend years or decades living in that kind of situation. And my parents are an example of it, I'm sorry to say, but that's the reality of it. And so I'm going to go now, but just be very careful what you want out of life. Be careful what you want out of relationships, especially, because the last thing you want to do is be with the wrong person for 20 odd years or 30 years. It's like you don't want to spend all of the best years of your life with the wrong person, or in an unhappy situation or unfulfilling situation where you're dissatisfied all the time, where you just feel bogged down with everything, that when you come home you don't there's no escape from because that's essentially what in many ways what relationships are, is a bit of an escape from reality, escape from the dark cold truths of being a human being, of mortality, of the difficulty of navigating this cold, harsh world of ours. We get this false sense of false illusion, false sense of security and comfort. And women can quite easily and often do very often actually can take that away from you. And so you know, you have to be extremely on your feet with women, I think, a lot of the time. And you have to suss them out as quickly as you possibly can. Because a lot of the time they are playing games, they're up to something, and they're testing you. They're testing you all the time. They're not telling you, but they're testing you. They're trying to figure you out. They're trying to see what they can get out of you, what they can't. Just how far they can push you, just how far they can get you to bend to their needs, and to how far they can mould you to the point where they think, right, I'm going to give up my independence to this person. Because that's essentially what it boils down to in the end, really. So just, you know, and if there are any young guys that come across this, listen to this, or young women, you know, just try and have a bit of awareness, self-awareness of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and you know, don't be so quick to rush into relationships. You know, don't be so quick to judge other people as well, because people are complicated. You know, people's lives are extremely complicated a lot of the time, and you don't really truly know someone until you spend at least a few years with them. And even then, you can know someone for decades and not truly completely understand them and know them. So, you know, don't be so eager to just try and like conform to what you think society wants out of you, or born out of like some degrees of peer pressure. You know, do what you think is natural and is moral and is right and is just, and try and do things as kindly and maturely as you can. You know, but live your life first. Go out there and live. I didn't live my life in my 20s. Apart from the odd bit of, you know, clubbing here and there, but I never really truly, I don't think, lived it. And I regret that now as a 35-year-old, you know. Sometimes that does bother me, because I've wasted, in many ways, some of the best years of my life. Don't make that mistake. Don't lay all of your problems at a man's feet or at a woman's feet, because it's not fair. It's not fair on yourself to do that. It's certainly not fair on the other person. You know, try and be sensible. Try and be wise. Try to do things for the right reasons. You know. Don't get so obsessed with lust and with fulfilling other people's desires and expectations of you. Do what you want to do, but also try and have some principles and values and integrity and self-respect at the same time. I'll catch you on another one soon.